What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another episode of the vlog. So, I recently came across a video by Arri. Obviously, they're way out of my price range. They're way out of my market segment. They're probably way out of most of the market segments and price ranges for the vast majority of people who are watching this channel. But for whatever reason, I like to look at high-end stuff like that and see what they're doing and sort of see how it's used and, I don't know, call it aspirational, call it just whatever, but it is something that I just have a tendency to do. Anyway, they put out a video recently, within the last couple of months, I think it was, talking about their impression filters for their signature lenses. Now, signature lenses are way outside my budget. They start at 25 grand, they go up from there. And the impression filters are they cost more than most Canon lenses, almost every lens that I own, just to start in on the impression filters. So, all of this is way outside of my ballpark, if you will. But the impression filters do something. They are functionally the equivalent of the spherical aberration ring that Canon put on their 100mm macro. And this video on Arri's impression filters, completely reversed my thoughts on the 100mm macro. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm going to run out and buy a 100mm macro, but it has gone from a lens that I have zero interest in as a product to a lens that, if I'm in the right position, I can get one for the right money, whatever. It's something that I might actually consider, if only to play around with the spherical aberration ring feature. And that, what really I want to talk about through this spherical aberration ring feature is sort of the biggest failing that I see from camera companies like Canon and Nikon and Sony. And it's simply the fact that they will put new technology into a camera. It's simply the fact that I've built most of this channel and most of the subscriber base, I think, on doing what Canon ought to be doing, which is explaining how things work and how to use things on your camera. Now, I'm not going to say that my explanations are the best that they could be or the best that are out there, and certainly if I had the resources of Canon and a crew and access to the engineers and all of that stuff, then, well, I'd have way better content, way better ability to explain this stuff. But the problem as I see it is that camera companies, Canon, Nikon, Sony, whatever, they will come up with a great idea. In this case, the spherical aberration control in the RF 100mm macro. They'll put it in a lens. And then the best that they will do to explain that is to plunk down a paragraph of text that kind of says what it does, but doesn't really tell you why you should care or why you should use it. Tying things together are funny. One of the things that Linus just talked about great videos and great marketing, Linus of Linus Tech Tips, is make it why you should care about something. That's the question you have to answer, really, as a video creator. A product or marketer. Why do you care? It's not enough to just say, it does this, and this is kind of what it does. You have to put in, I have to understand why I cared. I never cared. I read the marketing, I read some reviews, totally missed the point. So that's that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is I'm not convinced that Canon didn't miss the right market segment with this spherical aberration control that they put on the 100mm macro. So this is what I want to be talking about. So I think this is a great idea, the spherical aberration control. If you have a lens that has multiple focusing elements, as the RF 100 macro does, and there's many other lenses at this point now, and you can adjust them to create spherical aberrations at the user's command, or get rid of spherical aberrations at the user's command, then you can give abilities to do things. Because when you push comes to shove, when it comes down to it, there's some kinds of camera manipulation or image manipulations, I should say, that you just can't do or can't do easily in post. Spherical aberrations are one of those. It's one of the reasons why a circular polarizer is one of the filters that I still strongly consider or suggest people have. It kills glare, and you can kill glare with a circular polarizer optically with the polarization far easier than any piece of computer software could ever go through your image and try to figure out what it should see through the glare, assuming it can actually see through the glare. It's entirely possible that the information that you would have been able to pull out of out of reality by polarization is totally lost because it's completely blown out by the clipping reflections that are there. So there are some things that you can't just add a filter in post, and these are spherical aberrations are one of them. Why do you want this? I mean, why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because it recreates the look of old lenses. Old lenses weren't well corrected for spherical aberrations. So they did things to the bokeh as a result of the spherical aberrations that the lens had that weren't corrected. Now, here's where the great idea sort of runs into problems. The first one is not really explaining why this is interesting or why people should want this. I don't think photographers are dumb. But like anybody, when a new concept comes along, it's not always obvious to why that concept is good or important. Sometimes new concepts come along that I'm going to say it's obvious that they're not great. The touch bar on the EOS R is a perfect example, I think, of that. I can understand the whole concept of, well, it's touch and you can swipe like a dial, but then you could push like buttons and it kind of does both things. But the problem you run into is, what if you're wearing gloves? Touch doesn't work through gloves unless you have special touch-sensitive gloves. Well, that's a problem, especially when you're putting a critical control, like, say, ISO, on a thing that you can't control anymore because you have gloves on. Other places, like, that's an example of something where it's easy for sort of anybody to kind of figure out whether it's really good or bad. But this spherical aberration control, I don't think is that obvious. I think there needs to be some explanation. And that's where this whole video from Arri comes in on their impression filters. They do the same thing. Personally, I think they do the same thing a whole lot less elegantly. They're filters you have to put on the back of the lens. You have to take the lens mount apart. You have to put the filter on. You have to shim the lens for the filter. Then you have to put the lens mount on. You have to have a torque wrench. Because the screws have to be torqued down to a certain torque spec when you're reassembling the lens. I mean, compare that to what you can do on the RF macro. It's turn a dial and it's done. It's a hugely impressive concept if you understand the point. So let's look at this, talk about this video from Arri. I'm not going to include it here. I will put a link in a card and all that stuff so you can go watch it. And if you have even the slightest interest in the spherical aberration control, or you think it's a pointless thing and why anybody, and the questions in your head, why would anybody want this? I really suggest going and watching this video. So like I said, it does the same thing the SA ring does on RF macro. It adds spherical aberration to the lens. Now, let's put some context on this. I think I touched on this already, but just to make sure we're all kind of square on this. These are two completely different markets. An Arri Signature Prime starts at like 25 grand and they go up. Like, I don't think I have 25 grand worth of Canon camera equipment, period. I'm not even sure I have 25 grand worth of camera equipment, period. The impression filters that Arri's selling to do this, there's a whole series of them. They're between $2,000 and $2,600 for a kit. It comes with three of these filters and the stuff you need to install them. That's more money than almost any lens that almost every lens, with the exception, I think, of two that I have bought for my Canon SLRs, period, across the board. Everything that I've owned. going back through the entirety of history. So we're talking, this is seriously high-end stuff. And Arri, they're a company, they target Hollywood. That is their market. Broadcast, Hollywood, major productions, none of their stuff is cheap. These are the kind of people that target people that you would expect should know this. They should understand this. They should, like, this is not a thing that you need to explain the exact details of. And yet that's exactly what Arri does in this video. If you watch the video, most of it is talking about and showing, both showing and talking about what the different filter settings do, what the effect is, and how that affects the image and the perception of the image. And compare that to what Canon did. Granted, Canon's lens is way cheaper. Probably they're going to sell way more of them. I don't know if they're ever going to make the same kind of money Arri makes on the lenses they sell, given the, how many more of these macro lenses are they going to sell? But you look at what Canon's marketing did for the lens, and there's one paragraph on the product page that says, has a spherical aberration control ring, and there's a little bit of text that says it does this. It doesn't tell you how this is perceived. It just assumes, I think, you understand this, or that you know this, or that you see value in this. You understand why this is a useful thing to have, which I think is completely lost on the vast majority of the photography market anyway. I think this is something that makes far more sense to cinematographers because of the lenses and the whole situation with cinematography and motion pictures versus like the whole situation with still photography. At least that's my experience with the whole thing. I looked at Canon's marketing, I read some reviews, and I went, why would I want to do this? This is stupid. Where's the value in any of this crap? Like, why add this? No explanation. This is compounded in some ways too. Well, I should say before I start that thought, watching this Arri video from Arri about their impression filters totally blew my mind. Like I said this at the start of the video, it totally reversed my position on this Canon lens because I understand now why this might be valuable. Now, I'm not saying I'm running out to buy one. I'm still not in that camp yet. But I'd certainly like to play with one. And if I get an opportunity to pick one up at a reasonable price or on, with a discount, a promotional offer, whatever that Canon has going, that can get me one for less than the $1,200, then, I'm seriously thinking about that. But none of this came from Canon. They don't have a video on this. I've never seen a video where Canon really gets into talking about why you should care about or want this spherical aberration control. The third problem with this whole thing, and this is the part I think maybe that concerns me going forward, is that because Canon had the right idea but put it on the wrong lens, the whole thing may be just doomed. So what do I mean by this? Well, the 100mm macro really has two markets. So one market is macro users, and I think that's the market the lens gets pushed at the most, and it's the market that's probably going to be the most critical of the problems the lens has. Because let's be honest, the lens isn't perfect, and this whole discussion isn't about somehow how it magically became perfect now that I understand one of the functions way better. It still has problems. There's still a focus shift when stopped down, and that still is an issue. The other part of the market that uses these lenses, and I've seen plenty of people who do this, are portrait photographers. It's that middle prime, fast prime between the 85s and the 135s, and typically because it's a macro lens, they tend to be very sharp, maybe more so than an 85 or 135 is designed to be. And that works in certain environments. And it's maybe more the portrait photographer position than the macro photographer position where this spherical aberration control makes most sense. That's the place that Arri's talking about it in the context of cinematography, is you have people and you have a background and you're trying to make an effect of either opening up the background or making the background more claustrophobic, and that's what you could do with this. Whereas, like, Canon isn't really drilling home that point. And in part, it's hard to drill home that point, I think, because you have a lens that has this split market base. Is it the macro people? Is it the portrait people? Who do who are you talking to it? The bigger problem, too, is that there's, as I see it, and as this is, I think, the problem going forward, is that because of the issues with the lens, specifically the focus shift when stopping down from residual spherical aberrations, rightly or wrongly, there is a perception that this was a result of the spherical aberration control. And I'm not sure if that's true. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I see a lot of people who attribute stuff. I was in a big discussion years ago over dual pixel RAW and how it was a stupid gimmick because why would they need to add this? And could the person I was talking to could not sort of reverse their position and look at the side of the whole point of the dual pixel sensor is for focusing. And if we can read out the dual pixel sensor, each of the subpixels individually, then what can we do with that? It's not like, well, we designed a camera for this dual pixel RAW gimmick. It was we designed a sensor for this dual pixel RAW gimmick. It was we designed a sensor so that we had way better autofocus capabilities on the sensor. And this is a side effect of that. And quite honestly, I think maybe that's probably, I think that's probably more the case of the spherical aberration control on the RF macro. I don't think that that was the primary design or a primary design intent of the lens. Certainly it had to be designed into the lens. I'm not saying that it was, not a consideration at all, but I think that was sort of a side effect of, well, we're doing focusing with these two floating groups so that we can have fast, accurate focusing. And more importantly, and this is the big one, the 40%, 140% magnification, the 1.4x magnification, that I think was the driving factor of having two independent focusing groups in that lens. And then somebody realizes that, well, that also lets us mess with the spherical aberrations. Is we can drive one of those lens groups differently than the other than it would normally be, and here's this thing. One way or another, regardless of how it came about. The problem is that where does it go from here, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at. So the lens itself, I don't think was really well received. Certainly there are people that like the 100mm macro, but there's certainly a lot of people that don't like the 100mm macro, that blame the spherical aberration control for the focus shift, that don't like the fact that because it's a focus by wire lens, you don't have infinitely fine stepping at focus steps at macro magnification. It's not without its problems, the lens. And as a result, where does Canon go with the idea, with the technology? So it seems to me like, especially looking at what Arri's talking about, that spherical aberration control would actually make a lot of sense on like a video-centric 24-70. It's the kind of focal range where you have, you're shooting video, you're going to use that across the sort of scope and breadth of video. And having the spherical aberration control gives you the functionality that Arri is putting in with these imitation filters on their, or impression filters, on their signature lenses, and it does it in a Canon video-centric lens. But my concern, as I'm trying to get to, I guess, is that I think it might just be dead on arrival. The Canon's choice of putting spherical aberration control on a macro lens that was primarily being sold as a macro lens that also had a focus shift due to residual spherical aberrations rightly or wrongly, the spherical aberration control is blamed for that, or gets blamed for that. I've seen it in many discussions. And then the question becomes, with that kind of feedback, the lenses, I'm sure the lens is not selling as well as Canon would like it to. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But I see a lot of, like I said, it does not seem like it's a well-received lens. So with all of that in consideration, where do they go with this? Do they take the spherical aberration control technology and say, well, look, it's a good idea and it has merit, and let's put it in a lens that's more cinema oriented, like I said, a 24 to 70 f2.8 L cinema or something like that, or where the spherical aberration control makes more sense in being able to recreate that vintage look. I don't know. But that's what I wanted to talk about. And if you made it this far and you have any interest in any of why you would want this, I really do recommend going and checking out that Arri video. It's it was very illuminating to me to watch, to see, here's a company that's selling $2,500, $2,500 filters that go on the back of a lens to screw up the image quality in the same way that Canon is doing simply by driving a focus motor with an electronic control. Now, yeah, the implementation is going to be different in a mirrorless lens than a cinema lens, but the end result is basically the same. And the bigger point to me is the educational point. The fact that Arri actually talked about, this is why you do this, this is what it does to the frame, this is what to look for and how that affects things, whereas Canon just kind of didn't and assumed people would know. So I'm going to wrap this one up here. I hope you found this interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.